First up is The Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim, and this is a new animated film done in an anime style, and it is set 183 years before the events of Fellowship of the Ring, etc. So this is a territory that we haven't technically trod upon before, which is kind of exciting. Now, I am going to review this from a couple different perspectives because I think it's very much going to change your experience depending on which kind of section of the audience you fall into. So, if you are a hardcore Lord of the Rings fan, if you have read all the appendices, if you read the Silmarillion back and forth, if you're Stephen Colbert, basically, right? You will enjoy this film. I think you will have a respect for it. I think they were very strategic and smart in going over a section of, Tolkien history that there's not a lot of info on. This takes place in the world of the Rohirrim. We are following, the time of Helm Hammerhand, played by Brian Cox. Our protagonist is Gaia Weiss, who plays Hera, and then, just because we had to have some sort of connection to the other thing, Miranda Otto as Eowyn narrates the story. So, again, if you are deep into the lore and the mythology and stuff, this won't ruffle your feathers because it's not changing up any timelines or doing anything that, might mess with your perception of Tolkien, which is good. It might not be the most innovative thing around, but I think you will be like, it's cool to see this world that you love so much, and I love so much. Like, I have read the appendices. I don't know them back and forth. I've read the Silmarillion, etc., etc. I don't, I've read them once. I don't go back and back, but I do just love Lord of the Rings, and I especially love the movies. So, but anyway, if you are in that first category of just super fan, this isn't going to upset you. I don't know if it's going to become your favorite thing ever, just because I think it's set close enough to the events of the things that we've seen over and over, and it also has a lot of parallels to the events that we've seen over and over. So it's not going to mess with it, but it's also not going to necessarily innovate it for you. So I think it is worth watching if you fall into that category. If you are a hardcore anime fan, I don't know if this is going to do it for you. Now, I do think if you fall into the Venn diagram of anime fan and Lord of the Rings fan, you'll appreciate the style, and I think visually it's an interesting take on it. I, am not a hardcore anime fan by any means. I am, of course, an animation fan. I think there are a lot of very smart things they did with it, but I wasn't like, yes, this must be told in this medium, in this scenario. And I think for me, as somebody who is a Lord of the Rings fan, and then this is the third category, a huge Lord of the Rings movie fan, this is a little tough because you're like, well, I've kind of seen some of this before, and the style is a little bit different, and there are some clever things in terms of design where it's almost more simplistic, and I'm like, oh, this is smart, putting my animation hat on, this is smart, because that way you don't have to pay to animate every single detail, they actually hand drew this film in a lot of places, and so there are design choices that are very clever. I feel like maybe some of the details of the physical production of it are, missing. It's kind of, there's a cognitive dissonance of like the things you want to appreciate from it. It's a well done film. It's pretty solid. There's nothing that made me go, oh my God, how dare they do this? Like I would never recommend this to anyone, but it didn't quite get me in the way I was hoping. And maybe this is just me as such a nerdy Lord of the Rings fan, and nerdy Lord of the Rings and Lord of the Rings on screen fan being like, ooh, I wanted it to be closer to what I'm used to, or I want it to be more different, but it just kind of sits in this middle ground that maybe it just wasn't, distinct enough. And then as I was saying, hardcore anime fans, this is not classic anime. This is just sort of like in the style of anime. So be aware there. There are some things story-wise I definitely appreciated for this. There are tons of Easter eggs for the hardcore fans, but this just kind of sits in a middle ground for me, which is a shame because I really, really wanted to love this. If you are on the fence about it, but feeling generous, I think it is worth going to see. If you are on the fence about it and being like, I just don't care, or you are thinking that you might have a challenge with the media, and I don't want you to have a challenge with the medium of animation, but I don't know if the story on its own was enough to be like, yeah, go see this. So I'm really sad in some senses because I just think I was so excited for it and I wanted it to be something just absolutely mind-blowing and amazing that I could just, shout from the rooftops or blow the horn of Helm Hammerhand and, call everyone to watch this film. But this is just sort of a decent watch experience for me. It's not bad. It's not great. I'm going to give it a 3.6 out of 5. The next film I have is called Queer, and it is directed by Luca Guadagnino, and it's based on the William S. Burroughs novella. This is another one that I really, really wanted to love and didn't quite get there. So it stars Daniel Craig as an expat in 1950 in Mexico City, and he is just kind of wandering around living this, solo existence, and his character is queer. And there's, a small community of folks there. Nobody's out, but they also kind of have their little sort of semi-safe space. And then he meets a character played by Drew Starkey, and they form a relationship. And again, there's a few things about this, and I have to acknowledge I have not read the novella that this is based upon, so I can't compare it there, but This, in some senses, is more of a story about addiction than it is about, homosexuality or relationships. And I guess you could look at it as Daniel Craig's character is addicted to Drew Starkey's character in some senses. He's also addicted to drugs. Not a spoiler. Pretty apparent from all the materials. So there's a lot of sort of strange and more experimental things about this film that I think if this film had been shorter, I would have been more receptive to, but it got pretty self-indulgent along the way. It's 2 hours and 15 minutes. It feels longer. The other thing I grapple with is, I think Daniel Craig is a superb actor. I do not doubt his acting chops, but it's one of those things where it's like, well, his character is effectively out. Could we not have found a queer actor to portray this role? Drew Starkey's character is a little more on some sort of spectrum in terms of his sexualities, and I don't know a ton about Drew Starkey's actual personal life, so, no knocks there. But for Daniel Craig, I'm like, ooh, is this a role that could have gone to an actual queer actor? And, part of me thinks about the business side of it and is like, yeah, to get a film like this, such a wide distribution, etc., like, you maybe need a name like Daniel Craig, but shouldn't we be telling the best story with the best actors for it? And also, could we give opportunities to actors who may not have had the opportunity to do this before? It's one of those questions that I ask myself as somebody who does do a lot of analysis around this type of thing. And again, I think Daniel Craig is good in this, but I'm not like, yes, this is the performance of a lifetime for you. I think if you're looking at this because you're like, ooh, sexy Daniel Craig and Drew Starkey in a, romantic role, there's plenty of that for you in this. There's also the very surreal and kind of like, trippy stuff in this that I don't know if you're ready for. Also, this film has Jason Schwartzman and Leslie Manville, who I love so much, and she plays this just cuckoo bananas character. And this film, I didn't know a ton going into it. And so maybe it went more off the rails than I was expecting. And maybe if we're familiar, like I said, with the source material, you'll be like, yeah, no, this is a pretty decent adaptation. But from what I have heard, this is putting a spin on it. And I'm also like, I don't dislike Luca Guadagnino by any means, but I don't necessarily fall into the camp of like those who worship at his filmography. I think my favorite of his is, I respect Call Me By Your Name, but Challengers, which may be one of the more uneven ones, is also, I think, the most accessible of his work to me. So taking all of that into consideration, and this is definitely one of those weeks where I'm like, yeah, I'm not pushing anybody to see anything and run to the theater this week, which is a shame, but there are also plenty of other great films that are out there or on streaming, or whatever it is that you could watch. If you're on the fence and you don't know anything about this and you were just like, ooh, this is going to be a romance, I'm actually going to say maybe wait till this comes out on streaming or something like that. If you are a fan of the novella and you are a fan of Daniel Craig and you're willing to overlook any of the casting stuff, I think go ahead and see this film. I wasn't like, this is offensively bad. It just, again, was one of those films where I was like, I wanted to connect with this more. And I was very much taken out of it at a lot of points. And this is a criticism I do have of a lot of Luca Guadagnino's work. It can become very self-indulgent. This falls into that trap in the second half of it. The first half, I think, I enjoyed the exploration of their relationship and the kind of power dynamic between the two. And they definitely have on-screen chemistry. Like, there's no denying that. I think in that sense, they are well cast against each other. But I don't know, there's just something missing from Queer for me. And so I'm going to give this a 3.5 out of 5. The last film I have this week is The Last Showgirl, and again, one that I had heard okay things about and really did want to like. This one's from director Gia Coppola, and it stars Pamela Anderson as an aging showgirl on, in a Las Vegas style show, with the big feathery hats and the limited wardrobe and all those things, but like a classic showgirl style show. And okay, so this is a film where I think I have to give the most credit to all of the supporting cast, because they are clearly trying their damnedest to support Pamela Anderson in this, because they want her to succeed. And so, she is obviously like the kind of star of this film in many senses, but they have brought in, very cleverly, some heavy hitters for supporting cast. You've got Dave Bautista, you've got Jamie Lee Curtis, and I've just run myself. Jamie Lee Curtis also plays like an aging showgirl. Jamie Lee Curtis has an Oscar, man. I was like, she is doing a solid for this film, because she is giving Jamie Lee Curtis, Oscar winner Jamie Lee Curtis, and I was like, that's very kind of you to do this. It also has Kiernan Shipka, Brendan Song, and Billy Lord. And again, this film, and again, there are parts of this where Pamela Anderson shines, right? Because you can tell she connects to some of the maybe like ins and outs of relevancy that this character is experiencing. But then there are parts where she is being asked to act and she's not quite rising to the occasion. And that's where everybody else comes in as supporting players to try and kind of buoy this whole thing. Now, as a whole experience, I didn't dislike this film. You know, I wasn't blown away by it. I think a lot of people talked about it in the context of Pamela Anderson and having this, you know, dramatic, serious role that is parallels her life in some senses, but also is a role. And I think she does kind of fall short on some of those parts. But it's interesting. I think they're trying, you know, it's kind of like an A for effort, but not for execution. I think again, because this is one of those weeks, if you're interested in it, you're okay with the material, and you're also like okay being a little uncomfortable and with the lead of the film not having the best acting chops, but you are feeling generous because you do know Pam Anderson, right? Like, I think she's able to parlay off of that, and that you are aware, like, there's a lot of parallels to her own life, and you're like, yeah, I can impose this. I think in that case, this could be worth watching. If you are somebody who, like, does not have any idea who Pam Anderson is and somehow heard about this film, and you're like, I want to see that, I'm going to say maybe not for you, just because, you know, I don't think, because she is in it so much of it, and because her acting choices are distinct, and yes, everyone else is doing a great job, but they are not the leads of this, like, I'm not going to push you to see it, or I'm going to say see it on streaming or one of those things. But Last Showgirl, it was rough. There are some of, I want to say, Dave Bautista gives, I think, one of his best and most understated performances of his career. I'm like, oh, Dave is such a good actor, and I don't think he gets used enough. But because he is being, you know, generous and being a supporting character here, I'm like, okay, I wish this was more, you know, I wish you had more to do in this. He has a fair amount to do, but I wish that balanced out a little bit more with everybody else. I'm going to give this a 3.3 out of 5.